Thank you for watching this presentation today about how linking climate solutions to the achievement of gender equality in education can not only help us to address the climate crisis, but also to multi-solve for some of our greatest social challenges to sustainable development. I'm hoping that you'll leave this virtual room with an understanding of how achieving universal access to quality, transformative education can increase our ability to tackle two of humanity's greatest challenges, gender inequality and climate change. While climate change may not discriminate when it comes to wreaking its havoc upon the planet, its impacts are most acutely felt by the most vulnerable and least skilled members of society. In many low and middle income countries, many of which also happen to be some of the most climate vulnerable countries, talking about the most vulnerable and least skilled members of society most often means we're talking about girls and women. Pre-COVID, UNESCO estimated that approximately 130 million girls of school-going age are out of school due to poverty, harmful gender practices like early and forced child marriage, and other social and economic factors. Our current pandemic threatens to see this number grow by 20 million more girls when schools reopen around the world. In the context of climate change, girls' access to education is often collateral damage. Because of strict and constraining gender norms, girls and women are often less exposed to life-saving information, resources, and skills because they are often excluded from participating in household and community decision-making, as well as risk reduction activities. As a result, women have lower life expectancy in the face of natural disasters. In some cases, women and girls make up to as much as 90% of those killed in weather-related disasters. Those who survive are highly vulnerable to human trafficking, sexual assault, all during post-disaster recovery in crowded shelters or temporary camps. In both prolonged and short-term weather-related crises, household coping mechanisms also put girls at higher risk of school withdrawal in order to help complete household responsibilities like fetching water in times of drought, or even forced early child marriage because their dowries can help ease the burden of stretching scarce household resources across multiple family members. Such responses threaten to change the course of girls' futures, perpetuating their marginalization and thus their vulnerabilities in ways that have long-lasting impact. But while the damaging effects of climate change tend to hit girls and women in low and middle income countries particularly hard, well-educated girls and women can be a powerful part of the solution. Research in girls' education has generated a long list of reasons why investing in girls' education is a good idea. This includes increased economic empowerment, reductions in early and forced child marriage, which means also a reduction in early childbearing, increased agency, increased agricultural productivity, and the list goes on and on. But what research has just begun to key into is that girls' education may also be a formidable mechanism for mitigating against weather-related catastrophes and adapting to the long-term effects of climate change. For starters, when girls and women are better educated and included in decision-making at all levels, their families and communities are more resilient to and capable of adapting to economic and environmental shocks, and are better able to plan for, cope with, and rebound from climate crises. Looking at this at a global level, data suggests that there is a strong positive association between the average amount of schooling a girl receives in her country and her country's score on indices that measure vulnerability to climate-related disasters. Beyond these reasons, we also have to understand that addressing climate change isn't just a technical challenge of reducing or sequestering greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also inherently an adaptive challenge requiring us to think, be, and do things differently. Unfortunately, our focus has largely been on technical solutions targeted at closing the emissions gap. Missing is attention to the educational solutions targeted at closing the gap in knowledge, skills, and attitudes about climate change required to achieve our climate goals. This includes awareness of both the technical drivers of climate change and the systemic drivers, including the underlying social structures and relations of power that increase the risks and vulnerabilities to climate change for some groups more severely than for others. This means tackling issues of poverty, gender inequality, the denial of human rights, and low quality of education that disproportionately impact or affect girls and women around the world. If we look at climate financing, however, nearly all of investments are concentrated on mitigation activities like efficient and renewable energy technology and low carbon transport. Not only do these trend as highly technical, but also as high tech. And as a result of gender norms, gender stereotypes, and gender gaps in science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM skills, these are also highly male-dominated industries. This is in stark contrast to efforts at improving our individual and collective adaptive capacity to climate change and our ability to moderate or avoid harm. However, even within our adaptation efforts, there is a striking absence of attention to education, a vital pathway to building both adaptive capacity and climate resilience. So in terms of context setting, it is important to realize that we undercut our ability as human society to tackle climate change if we ignore both the disproportionate negative toll that climate change has on girls and women, as well as the contributions that educated and empowered girls and women can make towards climate solutions. To help focus us on the specifics, I'll turn now to 3 ways through which research suggests investments in girls' education can contribute to climate strategies by reducing inequalities, facilitating the achievement of gender equity, and helping to close the education gap. The first platform is focused on increasing investments in quality, transformative, and empowering education for girls, including comprehensive sexuality and reproductive health education in an effort to promote girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights. This platform is grounded on the evidence that suggests increased levels of female education is strongly linked to smaller, more sustainable families. While this effect depends on context, on average, women in sub-Saharan Africa who have a primary education have 1 fewer child in their lifetime than women without any education. And that number drops to nearly 3 fewer children for women with a secondary education. In the context of climate change, such an outcome can result in a reduced overall population by 1.5 billion people by 2050 and up to 5.7 billion people by the next century, potentially leading to less overall carbon emissions over time. Some of you might be familiar with the solution as girls' education together with family planning has been highlighted by Drawdown as one of the most powerful climate solutions in terms of its potential to reduce 85 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. In Drawdown's current modeling, health and education is outranked only by 1 solution, reducing food waste. The previous 2017 models placed it as number 1. This platform for girls' education is premised on the assumption that increasing the years of schooling for girls helps to delay the first age of birth, increasing spacing between births and decrease infant and child mortality. The relationship between education and fertility has been made popular both by the climate science and the population health and environment communities, and has helped bring greater visibility to girls' education as a viable climate strategy alongside more technical solutions. But I also want to point out some caveats to this platform, in particular to its outsized emphasis on the impact of years of schooling on fertility rates, as well as a narrow focus on a single relationship between population dynamics and carbon emissions, mainly the number of people on the planet. So first, while population and climate change are inextricably interlinked, this relationship isn't just influenced by the sheer number of emitters, but also by how we're emitting, our patterns of emissions. For example, research suggests that a smaller but more educated and urban population actually emit higher emissions per capita compared to a larger but less educated, poorer and rural population. When you also factor in the nuances to accurately measuring carbon emissions, you can see that we can easily get caught up in a numbers game. For instance, populations can decrease their direct emissions, but increase their consumption of high carbon goods. In this case, we're merely offshoring our emissions through carbon colonialism, rather than changing the underlying consumption patterns driving global emissions. Second, fertility cannot be and is not the only mechanism through which girls' education is a solution to climate change. Indeed, investing in girls' education for the purposes of reducing girls' and women's fertility is an ethically dicey approach, as its focus on girls and women in the global South can easily be co-opted by racist agendas to control Black and brown women's reproductive decisions. In fact, research shows us that the relationship between education and fertility is a bit more complicated, influenced by a number of factors, including access to family planning, girls' and women's control over their reproductive choices, whether or not there is equal decision-making power in an intimate partner relationship, and so on. Simply staying in school longer doesn't guarantee reduced fertility. Unfortunately, this is often a key assumption in the model's focus on education's impact on fertility. And 3, an instrumentalist approach to girls' education also risks overlooking a rights-based approach to girls' and women's sexual and reproductive health. Research has shown us that an empowering education that promotes girls' reproductive rights and attends to issues of gender and power is a more important determinant of girls' reproductive health outcomes than the number of years she's in school. Without attending to the quality of her education, she could be sitting in school for 12 years learning that her role in society is to join the marriage market rather than the labor market, or that her value in society is determined by the number of sons she bears rather than by the number of ideas and innovations she creates. A focus on girls' education for its impact on fertility places the onus of reducing carbon emissions on women's wombs, especially women in low and middle income countries, while ignoring other population factors and patterns of emissions, especially in high and upper middle income countries, that might have as much importance, if not greater impact on the environment. So if more investment is driven to girls' education, the approach must be grounded in a rights-based framework aimed at achieving girls' empowerment, gender equality, and climate justice. reduced population is a positive but secondary outcome of all of this. Building off of this is the second platform, that quality education plays a critical role in fostering girls' leadership and women's capacity to participate in climate decision-making. This platform is grounded on research that shows a clear linkage between women's leadership and pro-environmental outcomes, as well as studies that demonstrate the importance of formal education and mentorship on the trajectories of women in corporate and political leadership positions. For instance, here on the left are the results of an earlier study of 130 countries that shows that countries with greater representation of women in parliament are more likely to ratify environmental treaties. This relationship between women's political leadership and state environmentalism was stronger than any other factor, except for GDP per capita and population size. On the right, in a more recent study of 91 countries, researchers found a strong relationship between female representation in parliament and a country's climate score, the Climate Laws Institutions and Measures Index, which measures boldness of climate change mitigation policies adopted by countries. The researchers also found that a 10-unit increase in female representation resulted in a 0.24 metric ton decrease in carbon emissions per capita, and that this effect was mediated through the more stringent climate policies passed as a result of more women in political leadership positions in the country. That's the equivalent of the average American not driving their car nearly 600 miles per year. Still, another study of 72 countries found that a 1-unit increase in a country's score on the Women's Political Empowerment Index was associated with a nearly 12% decrease in the country's carbon emissions over the long term. So the evidence for girls and women's political empowerment is building. Here, the theory of change rests on a quality education, increasing girls' skills and opportunities, which then increases girls' sense of agency and empowerment, translating into their likelihood to take up leader positions later as women. Importantly, these impacts may not necessarily be the result of female leaders. For example, it may not be that women are a greener gender, but rather that feminist leadership, which is more likely to be embodied by women, and feminist societies, as opposed to patriarchal ones, create the conditions of equity and equality necessary for improved environmental, social, health, and economic outcomes, as we've seen presently with national responses to COVID-19. While there are many organizations focused on women's participation in climate decision-making and climate solutions, like climate-smart agriculture, disaster risk management, planning and response, there are few looking to develop girls' leadership opportunities to create a pipeline for their development as climate leaders. In many ways, efforts targeted at women may come too late, given the cumulative social and psychological effect of being denied access to education across their lifetime. The large number of girls leading student climate strikes around the world will hopefully help focus attention here. The third platform for girls' education and climate strategies rests on the evidence that quality education plays a critical role in ensuring girls develop key life skills to navigate the world. But our analysis of life skills suggests that the kinds of transferable skills targeted by girls' life skills programs overlap a great deal with the competencies or the green skills required for a just transition to a climate-resilient green economy. These include skills like systems thinking, futures thinking, divergent thinking, and critical thinking. Indeed, an investment in girls' education is critical to developing girls' skills needed to participate in green sector jobs. This is important given the marginalization of women to the fringes of our present fossil fuel dependent economic systems. If green sector industries become the driving economic force that they have been projected to become, centering girls and women in this transition will be vital to their inclusion in an alternative, regenerative, and more inclusive economic system. Rightly so, discussions around the need for a just transition to a carbon neutral green economy have been about the achievement of climate justice for communities most negatively impacted by climate change and most likely to be excluded by mainstream measures to mitigate against risk and harm. Globally, this means discussions about the green economy also need to be about the skills, capacity building, and training needed to ensure marginalized communities have a place in this new economy. At present, industries like agriculture and tourism that have the greatest potential for environmental innovation are already key to the world's poor and to the majority of women in these sectors. Current estimates suggest that green sector jobs currently employ millions of people and that these jobs will continue to grow. So when we think about investments in girls' education in the context of climate change, the theory of change for Platform 3 rests on the notion that a quality transformative education can help provide girls with the necessary skills to adapt to not only a changing world impacted by climate change, but also a changing world of work. In this case, one that is intended to be greener. However, with women occupying less than a quarter of jobs in the clean energy sector, for example, education as usual will ensure women continue to occupy spaces at the margins of a green economy, just as they have in our present fossil fuel driven economy. But perhaps an investment in girls' green skills can help ensure girls not only participate, but also lead innovation in climate resilient and green technologies and industries. This includes specific capacities like STEM skills, where green industries will inevitably emerge, as well as investment in empowerment skills and life skills critical to girls' and women's success and flourishment in green careers. Notably, a focus on green skills for green sector jobs orients education programming to overly emphasize technical skills or specific capacities, an approach that again overlooks women's unpaid green labor in care work and community development. This green labor is often focused on strengthening people's resilience and adaptive capacity to climate change, informing current and next generations of the centrality of regenerative behaviors, and serving as an essential first response during and after climate-related emergencies. So to avoid further perpetuating this dichotomization of green jobs from care jobs, Platform 3 also demands a parallel process that expands our definition of green jobs to include those sectors and industries that have been rendered invisible and undervalued due to the predominance of women in their labor force. This also means breaking down the gender norms and gender stereotypes that have traditionally defined care work for women and STEM work for men. It is here in a discussion of green skills and green jobs where we enter a new point of departure to understanding not just girls' education as a powerful climate solution, but also education in general as a powerful lever of change to more radical, bold, transformative climate action. But it's not just any education that we're talking about. Our society is the most educated in human history, yet also the most self-destructive. Indeed, education as we currently know it is part of the problem. Specifically, it's been complicit in perpetuating an unquestioned commitment to neoliberal individualism, extractive capitalism, profit over people and over planet, planned obsolescence, and unfettered economic growth. Rather, what Platform 3 leads us to is to a discussion about quality, empowering, and transformative education that leads not only to behavioral change, but more importantly, to mindset change, paradigm shifts, and new ways of seeing, doing, being, and being with others in this world that can help address the underlying root causes of climate change and its uneven impacts across different communities. So let's take a step back to consider that systems change is challenging, and that some types of action are more impactful than others. This figure, which Karen O'Brien adapted from Donella Meadows, illustrates how the behavioral and technical responses that we gravitate towards, because their outcomes are observable, trackable, and measurable, actually hold the least power when it comes to transforming systems. What carries more weight, however, is political change. And more than that is personal change, or changes in those beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms, which can then dramatically alter our social structures and economic systems to make more socially and politically palatable the radical practical responses that are out of reach today. Indeed, by empowering individuals with knowledge, building their green skills and sense of political agency, and developing their personal connection to climate solutions, we can create the necessary conditions for the mindset shifts that influence day-to-day behaviors and lifestyle decisions with real consequence, and consequence that can be measured. Research suggests that quality climate change education, defined here as one grounded in both knowledge of climate science as well as personal connections to climate solutions, can reduce an individual's carbon footprint by nearly 3 tons per year. That's the equivalent of not driving a car 7,000 miles in a year. If such education were implemented over the next 30 years to 16% of secondary students in upper, middle, and high-income countries like the US, we could see a reduction in nearly 20 gigatons of carbon by 2050. This outcome, estimated by Eugene Cordero and colleagues, is better than 3/4 of the top climate solutions available to us today, including things like concentrated offshore wind turbines and electric cars. But consider for a moment, this effect is for 16% of secondary students in upper and middle income countries. If such an education were available to all children, youth, and adults, and if that education was rooted in principles of equity, fairness, and justice, the impact on the personal dimension of change could be game-changing. So it was from this point of departure that we developed a green skills heuristic to better help governments, policymakers, and stakeholders conceptualize and design their path to a greener world through a more gender informative or a gender empowering and transformative education system. This heuristic synthesizes a large body of knowledge and practice and outlines 3 approaches to quality education for climate action based on how we frame the problems underlying the climate crisis. Whether we frame the climate crisis as a technical or an adaptive challenge, whether we conceive of the source of the problem as an issue of greenhouse gases, as unsustainable individual behavior, or as a symptom of unjust social and economic systems, whether the vision of the solution is a just transition to a green economy, the development of more sustainable behaviors, or to the transformation of more equitable systems. It also aligns with a framework for green skills, from the specific to the generic to the transformative capacities that are required to increase our collective resilience and adaptive capacity. This heuristic enables policymakers and stakeholders to gauge where their education systems are on an incremental journey towards more radical climate action, with an eye towards implementing all three approaches. When taken together, we're calling this a new green learning agenda because it is at its heart a comprehensive, critical feminist effort to transform our education and training systems by reorienting them towards climate action and the achievement of gender, racial, intergenerational, and climate justice. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into further details of each approach, but I will say that regardless of how the climate crisis is framed, our education solutions for it must be wholeheartedly and unapologetically feminist. There can be no climate justice without gender justice. And achieving gender justice is dependent on whether our societies not only fight to ensure girls and women complete at least 12 years of quality, empowering education, but also on whether they aim for girls and boys to see the human and natural world through a feminist planetary consciousness. Such an awareness that our human challenges are intricately tied to the health of the planet is vital to our collective ability to transform our presently unsustainable socio-ecological systems. If you're interested in learning more about a new green learning agenda, I encourage you to check out our new report on the Brookings website. So to recap this presentation, we know that tackling climate change is going to take more than environmental knowledge and technological solutions. It will also require sociological solutions that address the underlying root causes of climate change, which include a rejection of the dominant social and economic ways of thinking, being, and doing that are built upon the exploitation and oppression of the most marginalized, especially girls and women. We also know that investing in girls' education is a foundational strategy for addressing the underlying gender inequalities driving much of the unequal impacts of climate change. In fact, climate researchers have modeled different development scenarios and their impact on our ability to keep global warming levels within 1.5 degrees Celsius. They found that social justice and equity issues are requirements for human society to be able to keep warming within 1.5 degrees. And based on the research synthesized here today, we know there are three ways we can focus our investment in girls' education as climate solution. By implementing gender transformative education that promotes girls' reproductive rights, that fosters girls' leadership, and develops girls' green skills. And from there, we have an on-ramp toward a new green learning agenda that transforms our education systems more broadly towards climate action and climate justice. Thank you for your attention.